By 1996, Bernie, it was very typical of CBS reporters and personnel. He had never voted for a Republican in his life. He was alerted to a a segment from his network, from CBS, in which a reporter was describing Steve Forbes, who was running for president then, his flat tax. And in a scenario that will be familiar to all of you, the reporter brought in unidentified experts, identified only as experts, but actually leftists, who attacked the flat tax plan and described the plan objectively as wacky. And this disturbed Bernie enough that he wrote an op-ed piece, a column. Well, he had actually taken his sense of discomfort with this so-called reporting to executives at CBS. So Bernie wrote a column for the Wall Street Journal called "The Networks Need a Reality Check." And in it he said, we have a free press, but we no longer have a fair press. It's pretty radical. For this, Bernie was called a traitor. The head of CBS News told him that his column was as though he had raped his wife and kidnapped his kids. And this reporter, who was a friend, has never spoken to you again, I guess. Or no. Stopped speaking to him. And as Bernie said, after a quarter of a century, and by the way, we have his books. His books are wonderful. I mean, they are such great reads, and tell you all the unpleasant news about our media. He said, I had become an unperson, which is that's a term you apply to Stalinists. They make you, they airbrush you out of the picture. Anyway, I'd like to start this conversation by putting this to Bernie. You used to be a liberal, and how did you change?
Well, before I answer that, I wasn't sure if David was going to bring up how I got here. Can I tell the story?
Go ahead.
David contacted me and asked if I would speak to all of you, and I said no. Which may have been the right decision. We'll find out before the morning is over. And I said no because I had gone on a cruise with sponsored by a conservative magazine, and I was one of the guest speakers. And the subject went around to media bias, and I mentioned all the things that they like to hear, not because they like to hear it, by the way, but because I actually believe the things. And then I mentioned things about conservative media bias. And what the people didn't quite understand is that I'm not an activist, I'm an analyst, I'm a journalist. So if the subject, whatever the subject is, but in this case, if it was bias, I'll answer the question about bias, whether it's liberal bias or conservative bias. We were in a beautiful auditorium with 700 to 800 people, and a good percentage of them started booing and hissing. So I said to David, and if I didn't say precisely this, I'll say it now. It wasn't that the booing and hissing hurt me, but it saddened me that I realized that our side could be just as orthodox as their side. That's what really troubled me, that our side should be better than their side. But what I realized was all these people who say they like fair and balanced, that's a bunch of crap. They like their biases validated just as much as liberals want their biases validated. Liberals go to MSNBC to hear their propaganda, and while Fox does present both sides to its credit, and thank God for Fox, because a whole bunch of views would never get out if it weren't for Fox. They do certain things that, if you're going to ask me about bias, I'm going to mention their bias as well. And I realized that these 800 people, or whatever percentage of the 700, 800, didn't want to hear anything like that. And I said, David, I like the people that go to Restoration Weekend. They're here to have a good time. They're not here to hear me criticize conservatives. And he said, we're not orthodox. We're the one group that is not orthodox. Come. The silver-tongued orator talked me into it. Here I am, but because I really do understand that you traveled, from all sorts of places to have a good time, if you want to hiss and boo, be my guest. That's fine with me. Now, to the question of that David actually asked about how I move from one side to the other. I grew up in the Bronx, where I think I'm literally correct about this. Certainly in my neighborhood, there were no Republicans. I mean, none. I don't mean almost none, none. Everybody, it was a lower middle class neighborhood. Everybody was a blue collar worker, and my parents were Democrats. When I first started thinking about politics many years later, I thought it was just in my DNA, and I was a Democrat. I certainly in college was a liberal Democrat, and proud of it, because I think in those years in the 60s, liberals were on the right side of issues and conservatives, frankly, were on the wrong side of issues. The most important moral issue of the 20th century, civil rights, conservatives were on the wrong side of that issue. It's really simple as that. Not Republicans, but conservatives. And not all conservatives, obviously, but conservatives were the ones who were on the wrong side of history. So I was a liberal, and not necessarily proud of it or not proud of it, I just was. And then I started, in 1981, Dan Rather took over the CBS Evening News and asked me to come to New York, and I reluctantly did. And I started noticing things that I hadn't noticed before. Ronald Reagan had just been inaugurated, and I started noticing all these reporters who were calling him an amiable dunce. And I said, what the heck is this about? I mean, he's the President of the United States. He just got inaugurated. But he was an amiable dunce, and that bothered me. Then I saw the biggest stories of the 80s, I'd say, how they were covered, homelessness. The people I ran into on the street going to CBS News were talking to the homeless people, were talking to spaceships. They were either schizophrenic, alcoholic, or on drugs, almost all of them. And that's statistically true. Of the homeless street people, almost all of them fit into one of those categories. But the homeless people I was watching on the air looked exactly like you people. They looked really just like you, because CBS News and the others realized that if you want your audience to pay attention, show them people who look like their neighbors and not people who the homeless really look like. That bothered me too. Then came along what I think is the worst covered story of the 20th century, AIDS. Now, let me make clear, if even one person in the whole world has AIDS, it's a terrible tragedy. Terrible tragedy. But the people on the air, and there were studies to back this up, but I just noticed it by watching the news, the people on the air who had AIDS, again, looked just like all of you, all of us. But the people who had AIDS in real life were junkies and homosexual men. But we rarely put homosexual men on, and we rarely put junkies on. So what the hell is going on here? And I started to put the pieces together, and I came to a conclusion. And the conclusion was that the media wasn't just covering these stories that were important to a lot of people on the left. They were championing these causes, and I didn't want to be part of that. Then I saw how, let's go back to civil rights to use as an example. I said, I'm a liberal. I was a liberal, as I said, growing up. I was a liberal in college. But this affirmative action doesn't make a lot of sense to me, not when a black kid whose parents may be professional people gets to check off a box and gets extra points at college or for a job, but a white Anglo-Saxon Protestant kid whose father's a coal miner in West Virginia doesn't get to check off a box. How is that kid privileged? So I wasn't happy with that. I was all for women's rights, and then the feminist movement came along and said that women had the right to be firefighters even if they couldn't carry a man out of a burning building, because they wanted to be firefighters, so they had the right to be firefighters. I said, no, I don't think so. Then I noticed how my liberal friends were jumping through hoops to defend this kind of crap. And it was embarrassing. It was embarrassing, the excuses they would make to defend this. And then as I started to make a slow transition, they said what it was understandable. They said, well, you're making money now, that's why you're becoming a conservative. And that wasn't totally untrue, but it wasn't mostly true either. It wasn't that I was making money. This is a very important point for me. It was that I was being called names. I was being vilified. The liberals were saying, you're not paying your fair share. That's what they say to all of you. No, we're paying more than our damn fair share. It's the 47% who pay no federal income taxes who aren't paying their fair share. So it was a combination of all these things, and in the end, I don't know if I left them or they left me. Probably a little of both. But I'm not on their team anymore, and this puts them out of whack, because they say things like, well, you're not really a conservative. I say, no, I am. Why do you say that? And what they say in their own way is, you can read and write, you don't drag your knuckles on the ground, you're not a racist. This is their cartoon caricature of conservatives. This is what these are smart people I'm talking to, and they really believe this. They really believe that that's who we are. Well, that's not who we are, and I'm not one of them anymore, and I'm thrilled that I'm not one of them anymore.
Do you want to just run through, I mean, here you had this example, which was on, it's a video, so everybody can see it. There's a script. And you did get a chance to talk to some of your colleagues and point out that this is biased. And what's their reaction when that happens?
When you point out that there's bias?
That they are biased, that they're biased to the left.
It's interesting. Bad things happen to people when they live in a bubble. Because inside the liberal bubble, which is very comfortable, and this is where the elite journalists live, inside this liberal bubble, you can go for a day, a week, month, year. You can practically go a whole lifetime and not run into people who have different views than you have. So you say, look at this story that, as David says, was just on the air. Look at this. You can't possibly defend this. Well, this is going to sound crazy, but trust me, I was there for 28 years. I know I'm right about this. They don't see it as biased because they don't see their views as liberal. They see their views inside this bubble as mainstream, as moderate. They see everything to the right of center as conservative, which it is. And they see everything to the left of center as middle of the road. So if you have this feeling about, where the middle of the road is, they don't see their ideas as liberal. They see their ideas as decent. reasonable. And therefore, they dismiss you as, you know, somebody with an agenda. Now the fact is, this is another fact, if you're, in my 28 years, just so you know, I was never once accused of having a conservative bias. Because most of my 28 years I wasn't even a conservative. But even when I was never accused of having a conservative bias. Again, I'm a journalist. I will criticize conservatives when they need to be and liberals when they need to be. But if you're this much to the right of center in a typical American newsroom, this much, you will be noticed. You will be noticed. You're a conservative. If you're this much to the left of center, you will fit right in. You will not be noticed. And that's the problem. The problem isn't a conspiracy. The problem isn't that Dan Rather, in my day, Dan Rather called his top lieutenants into a room and pulled the shades and doused the lights and gave the secret handshake, you know, and the secret salute, you know that one? And said, how are we going to screw, you know, those conservatives today? It never, ever, ever happened that way. The problem is groupthink. You have so many like-minded people in one place where nobody is ever telling them that they're wrong about anything, except, you know, the one conservative in the place who says this is wrong. You can almost not blame them for not believing me. That's what happens when you live in a bubble. It's not good for anybody to live in a bubble, but it's especially not good for journalists to live in a bubble.
And that's one of my biggest criticisms of conservatives, just to help you out there, is that conservatives collude with these people in calling them liberals. Because that makes them actually, I mean, they don't like you to call them liberal if there's an audience which might resonate sort of against liberalism. But they like to be called liberals because it means that they're tolerant.
Exactly.
You know, they're decent people. And I think Bernie is exactly right. I mean, I think your phrase is if a fish doesn't know when it's wet. You know, they're decent human beings, and their decency is involved in seeing you as extremists and indecent.
Yeah, well, by the way, that term, I use that term, fish don't, I thought I got it from a George Clinton Funkadelic song called Fish Don't Know He's Wet. And some media critic who will never comment on media bias wrote a piece that said, Goldberg's at it again, saying that George Clinton and his band Funkadelic Parliament used that line, and they never used it. Okay, I'm wrong. I don't know where I got it from. It wasn't George Clinton, but this is what media writers write about. If you make one little mistake like that, they'll write about that, but they won't write about the elephant in the room, which is media bias. But my point was that, think about it, how would a fish know he's wet? He has no frame of reference. That's all he knows. Well, if you're in the liberal bubble and all you hear all day long are liberal views about all the big social issues of our time, how's that fish going to know he's wet? It just seems like the only position that a decent person would have. That's what I meant by fish don't know he's wet. They have no frame of reference.
Yeah, I've got several thoughts here. The first one, I just want to, I mean, Bernie is a classic journalist. And there has been a dramatic change, I think you would agree, in the media, that there used to be a time when there was a standard that people observed. Journalists of a previous generation probably, a lot of them didn't even go to college,
right,
let alone to J schools, to journalism schools. They went out and they reported what they saw. So how big an influence, I mean, and if you look at and this is where, I've done work on academic freedom and the state of the universities, so I know quite a bit about J schools. And you can go to, well, I once had lunch with with Michael Parks, who was, he's on the left as a journalist, but he covered the Soviet Union for the LA Times. did good reporting on that. And I said to him, Michael, he was chairman, they made him chairman of the journalism department at USC. I said, how many conservatives do you have on your faculty? He said, I can't think of one. And I said, well, do you think that's a good thing from a point of view of educating journalists? And he said, no. I said, well, what can you do about it? And he said, nothing, because the faculty chooses them, they hire themselves. And so once the left gets in, it's over. So all our journalists now are being trained by leftists. I can tell you there's no conservative at NYU Journalism School, certainly not at Columbia Journalism School, and on and on.
Right. Well, a couple of points. One, journalists and journalism professors would say, it doesn't matter if we're liberal as long as it doesn't come out in our work. And theoretically, they're right. But why do they worship at the altar of diversity? What if I said, well, what if every journalist was a white male, but he was an honest journalist, and he covered stories honestly? Would that be good enough? And the answer would be no, and they would be right. Because a white male can't see things the way a woman sees them, or the way a black person sees them, or the way a Latino person sees, or whatever else. So we have this push for diversity, but it's only a certain kind of diversity. And as a result, we have newsrooms filled with white liberals and black liberals, male liberals and female liberals, gay liberals and straight liberals, Latino liberals and Asian liberals. And this passes for diversity, but there's no intellectual diversity. And I've come up with a solution for this that a few years ago I was only kidding about, but I'm not kidding anymore. Now, I'm not saying it would be easy to implement, but I am serious about it. My solution is just 2 words: affirmative action. If you could jump through hoops to find, candidates for college or even for the faculty that fit every protected group, that we have lists for, okay, that kind of diversity is fine with me. I want to make that clear. I have no problem with that. Then go out and try to recruit some conservative professors, and try to go out and recruit some conservative journalists, and then tell both of them, keep your conservative opinions to your damn self, and then tell the liberals, keep your opinions to yourself. And what it would bring is a different perspective, so that when somebody writes a story, let's say about abortion, and it's a totally slanted story, at least somebody in the newsroom would say, whoa, hang on, you got to think about this. So I don't want conservative views in the news, and I don't want conservative views in the classroom. I want conservative perspectives for the same reason that we want black people in journalism, and women people in journalism, and gay people in journalism, and Latino people in journalism, and Asian, to get all these different perspectives. But I don't want their opinions in their stories. I just think that we see things differently depending on what group we're in, and we see things differently if we're conservatives rather than liberals. This argument would go nowhere in a room filled with liberals. It would be as if I was speaking Greek, They just don't get it. I once said, along with my fish don't know he's wet line, this is my second favorite, that I have met people who work the overnight shift at 7-Eleven selling cigarettes and Slurpees to insomniacs who have more introspection than most of the journalists I've ever met. They're smart people. They are smart people. But because they hang out with so many like-minded people, they don't see things that all of you see. They don't see those things.
Now, when Bernie had the bad judgment to write this article for the Wall Street Journal, his friends stopped speaking to him. They called him a traitor, and his boss compared him to a rapist.
Can I tell the Dan Rather story very briefly?
I'm going to get to the Dan Rather. No, that's what I'm. But I have two things here. Now, so if you deviate, or if you have the temerity to say the emperor is unclothed, you get cast into Siberia. That's basically what it is. It's an intellectual and social Siberia. So that had two effects. One, it's a blessing. If they had just let that article go and had a discussion and Bernie would never have written bias. He would never have written arrogance.
Exactly.
These are all wonderful books you should read, and never a slobbering love affair. Probably, maybe not.
No, you're right. You're absolutely right.
They made him one of us. Great. That is the blessing. The other side is, though, it's a form of terror against everybody inside the bubble, because if you think of moving in this direction, you become part of the untouchables.
Right. You've called this liberal Stalinism.
Exactly. Yeah, well, you compared it to the mafia in your books, which is quite right. Very, very powerful. You lose all your friends. That's not easy to do in midlife. Now, I want you to tell the Dan Rather story, because I have a slightly different take. I want to add to your perception of this.
First, let me make a comment about the liberal Stalinism. David refers to this, what we've been talking about is liberal Stalinism. And it's really a good term. And I was thinking about it, figuring the subject might come up at some point. And I realized that there has to be a component for liberal Stalinism to exist. And I touched on it earlier, but let me mention it again. And the component is moral superiority. That's a necessary component, I think, for liberal Stalinism. In other words, you're for affirmative action, I'm against it. I'm against it as it's practiced, meaning the kid whose father's a coal miner in West Virginia. Why doesn't he get points? Well, for liberal Stalinism to work, you have to think that I'm not only wrong, but my position is morally inferior to yours, and therefore yours is morally superior to mine. And if you honestly believe that your position on any issue is not just right, but morally superior, yeah, you're going to start to be a Stalinist on that issue, because it's not a matter of he thinks taxes should go up and I think they should go down. He thinks, I think that I'm better than he is. I think I'm morally superior to him because he thinks taxes should go one way and not the other. So that creates the kind of, gulag mentality. And by the way, I was sent to the gulag. I didn't get fired. I quit 4.5 years later to write Bias. Talk about payback as a bitch. I mean, you're right the way they treated me. I lost friends. People wouldn't be seen with me because Dan Rather might, let's put it this way, they worried that Dan Rather might punish them. Now let me tell you if they were seen with me, let me tell you the Dan Rather story. So I show this, what people have called incredible courage in writing a piece in the Wall Street Journal, but what I have called incredible stupidity. But it was one of the best things I've ever done, because I would have never written the books. You're absolutely right about that. I would have never started commenting on the news. So this was a great thing that I did, but I didn't know it. At the time, I did it because I had enough. For over a decade, I had spoken to them privately, quietly, about examples of bias that were on their air. They never told me to get lost. They never kicked me out of their office. It was as if I was talking to the wall. It didn't resonate. It made no sense. Thanks a lot, Bernie. Take it easy. See you around. So then this one thing with Steve Forbes, and it wasn't even a sexy subject. I mean, it wasn't about race or gender or this or that. It was about the flat tax. And I said, I've had enough of this crap. And I wrote this op-ed. So I know that it's coming out the next day in the Wall Street Journal. And by the way, the editor of the Journal called me. It was a fellow who's now on Fox, David Asman, was the editor of the op-ed page. And he said, we're running your piece on Tuesday. I said, be prepared to run my obituary on Wednesday. So Dan Rather is in Des Moines, Iowa, covering the Iowa caucuses. This is 1996, presidential election year. And I know it's coming out the next morning. I got to give him a call. I'm not looking forward to this, but I got to do it. So I'm in New York, and I call him up, and I say, Dan, I wrote something that's going to be in the paper tomorrow that you're not going to be too happy about, so I need to give you a heads up. Now, obviously, at this point, he has no idea what the piece is about. And he says, and this was in 1996, how many years later is that? 15 years later? I will give you the exact verbatim response, word for word. 15 years later, and I've got the exact response. He said, Bernie, we were friends yesterday, we're friends today, we'll be friends tomorrow. What'd you write? I told him, and my good friend Dan Rather never uttered another syllable to me from that moment until this moment. By the way, I've never told this part of it, but years later, 4.5 years later, when I was doing Bias, well, I guess I was writing, Bias came out 10 years ago next month. So I was writing and I was doing some research, and Dan Rather despised Connie Chung, despised her. Everybody who worked at CBS at the time knew it. They'd sit here like this, he wouldn't look over at her, let alone talk to her. Despised the fact that he had to share the anchor chair with this incredible lightweight, which was an accurate description of Connie Chung, by the way. But Dan despised her. But he never let on publicly because that's how Dan was, you know. So I'm doing this research for the book, and I come across an interview that Dan gave to the Boston Globe. And it was about Connie Chung joining the staff or whatever, becoming the anchor, whatever it was. And he said to the reporter, he said, Connie was my friend yesterday. She's my friend today. The hair on the back of my neck literally stood up. I mean, I didn't know this. And then a month later, Connie Chung got fired. So if you ever run into Dan Rather and he says, you know, you were my friend, yes, just head for the door. Just get the hell as far away from him as you can if he says that. What is your extended take on this? What is your extended take on this?
Oh, I don't know where this conversation, in that conversation with Rather, when you said that there was a left-leaning bias, instead of responding to that, he went into that he was a Marine? Or that he was...
Yeah, I got something wrong in the first edition because I wasn't taking notes. I wasn't writing a book. I was living my life. And I said, I made a slight mistake, but what you're saying is correct. I mentioned to him what the article was about. I said it was about something that was on the air last night, or the other night rather. And it was, I said, Dan, this was just wrong. It shouldn't have been on. It was wrong. And you're going to think I'm leaving something out from what I just told you to what I'm about to tell you. And then he says, you know, I signed up for the Marines. See, where the hell is this going? Now, I mentioned that he said he signed up twice. That part wasn't true. He signed, when he got kicked out of the Marines for health reasons, he signed up for the Army. So I was wrong about that. And I corrected that as soon as I could. But anyway, the gist of it was 100% correct. He said, I signed up for the Marines. I love my country. And I said, what the?
Well, I will explain this. See,
what does this have to do with anything? And then, but I realized, it took me a long time before I realized that if you accuse Dan Rather of putting on a broadcast, he was the managing editor, he wasn't just the anchor man, he was running the show, that had a liberal bias, it's going to sound crazy, but you were accusing him of being un-American.
Exactly. And this is, so I come from a much more obviously left than Bernie did. And so Bernie is describing the mindset of what once were actual liberals. But the media is filled with people who are dedicated leftists. And there's a kind of, well, there isn't a kind of, there's a united front between them. That's, you know, how Billy Ayers and Obama and they got a clean bill of health. There was a time when liberals in this country would have been appalled by the Billy Ayers and by Obama,
right,
and that would not have colluded with them. And this all ended in '68 when Tom Hayden created this riot at the Democratic Convention to destroy an anti-communist liberal, Hubert Humphrey. That's when the Democratic Party became a left-wing party. But for leftists who are impersonating liberals, they are anti-Americans. And Dan Rather would be somebody, you know, I don't, by this time, they all understand that if they're seen by the American public as on the left, well, they think, actually, they're very paranoid, so they think it's curtains for them. Unfortunately, it's not. Well, as you know, people like Michael Moore, you know, Michael Moore is a Leninist. You can be very popular and make a lot of money in America. I mean, we really have, our standards have so dramatically declined. So I think that's...
Yeah, I was criticizing a piece of journalism. That's all I was doing. But
they fear that, yeah, exactly.
They saw it totally differently. Well, he saw it totally differently.
As an existential
he saw it as attacking
threat.
His patriotism.
Yeah, it's an existential threat to them.
There's a word for this in psychology. This is crazy.
But it rules the roost. So, well, let me then ask you if things have gotten worse.
Yeah, it's a very important question. Let me jump to the end and say something you mentioned about journalism. I'll save it for the end of this thing. I bring you no good news today about if things are going to get better or not. I'll say that because of the journalism schools and all. So, have things gotten worse? Yes. Yes. It used to be about liberal bias in the news. It has moved from liberal bias to liberal or journalistic activism. You know what judicial activism is. That's where judges don't simply interpret the law, they legislate from the bench because they know what's better. Well, before, the Democratic candidates were people like Mondale and Dukakis, Gore, and Kerry. Obama was different. Obama was different. He was a historic candidate, and journalists weren't content simply being eyewitnesses to history as they had been in the past, where they merely put a thumb on the scale in favor of the liberal Democratic candidate. Now they had to sit on the whole damn scale because this was too important. This was way too important to leave to chance. And the press didn't elect Barack Obama. I want to make that clear. There were four things that elected Barack Obama. I mean, McCain was not a great candidate. The American people don't usually elect the same party 3 times in a row. the financial meltdown, and George Bush was an albatross around Obama's neck. And on the other side, Obama was young, he was cool, he was black, and he was liberal. If he had been three of those things, but conservative, there would have been no slobbering love affair for President Obama. But anyway, they went from media bias to media activism because this was a historic candidate and they had to throw everything they had behind it. And on Christmas morning, I'm going to give you a couple of real examples here. On Christmas morning, right after the election, a month after the election, page 1 of the Washington Post. I want to make sure everybody heard that. This is in page 83 of the Jerkwater Gazette. This is page 1 of the Washington Post. There was a story about Barack Obama's exercise regimen. Okay, I'm going to read you one sentence from the story, and I don't blame any of you if you think I made it up. I didn't, and you could, as they say, as Yogi Berra used to say, you could look it up. Was that Yogi Berra who said that? Yeah.
Must be.
Okay. I swear to God, this was in the Washington Post on page 1. The sun glinted off chiseled pectorals, sculpted during 4 weightlifting sessions each week, and a body toned by regular treadmill runs and basketball games.
Now, was that written by a man or a woman?
It was written by a man. It was written by a man, and it's the kind of stuff you'd expect to read in a romance novel with Fabio on the cover. Now, I could see where this guy may have gotten carried away, but editors let that crap get in the newspaper. They let that get in the newspaper. Okay, so that's one kind of what you might call harmless example of how things got worse right after the election. Then more recently, earlier this year, there was the debt ceiling debate. And this is how a number of, I'll give you the names of the people. Now, Chris Matthews. Wait, okay, I don't blame you. Chris, you see, this isn't just about, when I hear him speak, I get a thrill running up my leg. That's what Chris Matthews said, and he's a commentator, he's allowed to comment. But that isn't commentary, that's a man crush. Okay, so then during the debate on the debt ceiling, Chris Matthews referred to the Republicans as Wahhabis, the Tea Party Republicans as Wahhabis. Wahhabis is a sect of of Islam that's especially harsh and unbending and all that. Tom Friedman, he's a big-time columnist for the New York Times, referred to them as Hezbollah, a terrorist group. Tina Brown, who runs Newsweek, described them as suicide bombers on Morning Joe. Peter Goodman, who used to be with the New York Times and now is an editor at Huffington Post, said they're acting like terrorists. Yes, terrorists. That's what he said. A fellow named William Yeomans, who's a law professor at American University, wrote on Politico that the Tea Party caucus in the House were full-blown terrorists. Fareed Zakaria on CNN said, what they're saying is, we'll blow up the country if you don't listen to us. Paul Krugman in the... I thought I'd get another round of groans on that. Paul Krugman in the New York Times wrote, basically the Republicans said, we'll blow up the world economy unless you give us exactly what we want. Then Maureen Dowd, the perpetual junior high school student at the New York Times, she came up with a good one. She referred to them not as Wahhabis or other. She wrote a piece that was entitled The Washington Chainsaw Massacre, in which she referred to the Tea Party Republicans as monsters. No, but I mean really monsters. She said, they're an uncompromising new force that epitomized invasion of the body snatchers and evoked comparisons to our most mythic creatures of the night. Well, what kind of creatures of the night, right? Glad you asked. Quote, they were like cannibals eating their own party and leaders alive. They were like vampires draining the country's reputation, credit rating, and compassion. They were like zombies, relentlessly and mindlessly coming back again and again to assault their unnerved victims, Boehner and President Obama. They were like the metallic beasts in Alien, flashing mouths of teeth inside other mouths of teeth, bursting out of Boehner's stomach every time he came to a bouquet of microphones.
And the Occupy Wall Street criminals, they're idealists.
Yes, yeah. Okay, then the other day, if you didn't hear this, you'll think I'm making this up. There was a question at a live news conference in Honolulu, and the CNN reporter said that the other day at the Republican debate in South Carolina, several of the candidates said that they were, if not in favor of waterboarding, they weren't against waterboarding. And then the question was, and to me, nothing will ever top this in terms of, if they don't think this is bias, let's shut out the lights because you can never have a discussion with them. Here's the question to the president. He said, I'm wondering, right? I'm wondering if you think when he says they're, he's referring to the Republicans who are not against waterboarding. I'm wondering, Mr. President, if you think they're uninformed, out of touch, or irresponsible. These are the three choices. This is it. Were they uninformed, out of touch, or irresponsible? This is the White House correspondent. It just amazes me. And if you criticize this, you're the one who's the right-wing crazy who's always criticizing the media. But this should not be allowed. By their own people, this should not be. And by the way, to President Obama's credit, he just sat there for what seemed like a week, but it was like 3 or 4 seconds. He even looked embarrassed by the question. It was as if he wanted to say, man, look, I know you all love me out there, and I understand why you love me, but you can't do this. This makes me look bad.
To answer that question and to show how far we have slid in just the last few years. 10 years ago, Chris Matthews was a featured speaker at the weekend. And he gave, he started out as a Goldberg Republican and gave a speech on individual liberty and free economies, and everybody loved it. And he has turned in an amazing way, but I think he's symbolic of the whole media has shifted and become a left-wing media.
Let me just say that, in both in fairness and since this is going to happen, I want to look like I'm right down the road. They will be tough on Barack Obama from time to time. This is not 100% of the time where they're slobbering all over him. And they will especially be tough on him when his poll numbers are down. This is when they feel their oats, it's like he's down, so now we can kick him. But when he's actually running against a real opponent, hopefully, well, let me take that back. When he's running against a real opponent who will be more conservative, certainly than Barack Obama, whoever it is, that's when they will circle the wagons and jump back on the Obama team because they have too much invested in him. They sold out what little was left of their reputation, and now they have, now they're stuck. So they're gonna be with this guy, and it may not look like it every second of every day, but when push comes to shove, when he's up against a real Republican, and especially if it looks like he may be in trouble of not winning re-election, they will be back on Team Obama.
Yeah. They're the attack squad for Team Obama. I mean, they can be mildly critical of Obama if they're vicious on Republicans. So before we go to questions, would you like to get off your chest?
Yes, thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Here's the thing. Let me make clear that in this upcoming election, for instance, I will vote for Charlie Sheen before I vote for Barack Obama, okay? So I say that so you know that I'm one of you. But the orthodoxy that I see on our side troubles me. I go on O'Reilly and I say something mildly negative about Michelle Bachmann, with apologies to anybody in the room who supports Michelle Bachmann. And I get an email, the second sentence of which is, "I've always appreciated your commentary." That's an important point, because this is a person who likes me. The first 3 words of this email are, "You effing bastard." And it doesn't say effing, it's the whole word. And then he goes on to say, forgive me for the vulgarity here, "You're a goddamn leftist traitor. Watch your back, Bernie, because we're coming for you." You wouldn't laugh if it was aimed at you, I'll tell you that. "Resign now or your job will be the last thing you have to worry about." Okay? Now, I'm not saying I get 12 of these a day, but it's not unique. It's not unique because I criticized somebody that he likes. You have to, when I say something that conservatives like, when I'm on O'Reilly, I literally get love letters. I mean this literally, from people who don't know me, who say, "We love what you say, please keep saying it, thank you." And you know, a guy coming from, you know, lower middle class background in the Bronx, first person to go to college in my family, that means a lot to me. You stray that much and you hear from people like that, that troubles me. Then, you know, I made a note here because this is the one thing I did want, not the one thing, this is one thing I did want to get into. I said something that somebody didn't like about the Tea Party people. You know, I mean, I think the Tea Party people have done a great deal of good. I mean, if it weren't for the Tea Party people, we wouldn't be having a discussion about debt. We wouldn't be having a discussion about spending. They've done a great deal of good. But the Tea Party people, because they are what I call purists, along with people like Rush Limbaugh, who is very smart about politics, but he's a purist. These are people who want the most conservative candidate to be nominated, okay? I want to get to that in a second. So I said something, whatever it was, maybe it was, you know what it probably was? It was that the same Tea Party that did all this good also brought us Sharon Angle and Christine O'Connell, and I would rather have 2 rhino Republicans than 2 liberal Democrats in the Senate. That's a reasonable position. You may not agree with it, but you could understand that position. I mean, that's our real life choice. You know, those 2 were the Tea Party favorites because they were the most conservative, but they were disasters, and we got 2 liberal Republicans, one of them Harry Reid, by the way, because Tea Party had to be purist. So I get this email that says, "You fear and despise Tea Party candidates. We get it. You media elites must support the anti-American, pro-union, pro-illegal alien, pro-gay agenda, anti-business, pro-cultural diversity, social fascist agenda of Hussein the Destroyer. We get it. Go away, please, for the good of the country." Well, how about screw you for the good of the country? That kind of orthodoxy bothers me. That kind of orthodoxy bothers me.
During the Bush years, after 9/11, there were the truthers, people who thought that George Bush was behind 9/11. These people, I mean this literally, have a some kind of mental defect. Because if you think the President of the United States helped bomb, and killed 3,000 Americans, you're crazy. And I met some of these people, so I know where the craziness stems from. It comes from an irrational hatred of George Bush. Okay? So they're crazy, right? We all agree on that? They have their truthers, we have our birthers. And I'll bet you there are a few birthers in this audience. And the first birthers, so nothing personal when I say that I think you're nuts. The first birther I met was at this weekend in 2008. I said something negative about them, and I got literally thousands of emails on my website. And they say things like, you don't know what, the birth certificate is fake. That's the whole thing. And look at it under a microscope and you'll see that the E on the third line is really an X. I mean, this is what they actually say. And you're wondering, if the President of the United States wanted to come up with a phony birth certificate, would he really make the E an X? I mean, this is how crazy they are. Now you could say, they're fringe, you're fringe, and we could just ignore you. But there are two reasons I can't do that. One is that if they come out of the woodworks anywhere near the election, they could scare off enough independents that will make a difference. So if you want to believe this crazy crap, keep it to yourself until after the election. And the second thing is, it troubles me deeply that the leaders of the Republican Party, McConnell, Boehner, and Cantor, won't stand up to any of these people. McConnell was asked about a survey that showed 31% of Republicans, 31%, think Barack Obama is a Muslim. That's disgraceful. And he was asked about it. And he said, well, he says he's a Christian, that's good enough for me. Well, no, I don't think that's good enough. You're a leader. You have to say, look, he's a Christian, I wish this other thing would just go away. And when people say he's not a citizen of the United States, he's not a legitimate president, and they ask Boehner and Cantor that, they say, well, he says he was born in Hawaii, and I believe he was born in Hawaii, and people can believe whatever they want. No, I mean, yeah, legally they can believe whatever they want, but if you're a leader, you don't say people can believe whatever stupidity that they want, and it is stupid, and that bothers me about our side. Thank you. This would be a good time to boo and hiss if anybody wants to do that. Okay, you think I pissed you off with that? This one's going to really go over there. Bill, because you never talk about religion with people you don't know personally, so here goes. Bill O'Reilly asked me on the air, is it legitimate for reporters to ask about a candidate's religious beliefs? And I said, if religion is important in the candidate's life, absolutely. Now, I could have ended right there, but of course I didn't. And I said, let me give you an example. If somebody believes that the earth is 6,000 years old, then I said, something ignorant like that, then that may not affect the candidate's economic policy or foreign policy, but I guarantee you, it's going to affect something if you believe something like that. Hundreds and hundreds of emails followed that one. Now, I am as open-minded as anybody you'll ever meet. If you want to believe in God, that's fine with me. If you don't, none of my business. You want to believe anything based on faith is absolutely fine with me, as if it matters if it's fine with me or not. But it is. I couldn't care less one way or the other what people believe in terms of faith. But when we get articles in the New York Times or columns, Republicans against science, That troubles me because independence may be affected by that. And the earth is not 6,000 years old. It isn't, even if the Bible says it is. If the Bible says it is, and I'm saying it isn't, I'm right and the Bible's wrong. Yeah, that's absolutely a fact. And they're on our side, these people. And don't think there are 12 of them. There are millions of them who believe this kind of nonsense. And they're on our team. That troubles me. One word about Herman Cain. I like him. He seems like a real good guy. I know all of you like him. The point I made once was, let's say at some point, I don't think anybody should abandon him based on what we know so far. Friends don't abandon friends based on what they know at this point. But let's say at some point, I said hypothetically, let's say it comes out that, you know, this stuff is probably true. Conservatives who like Herman Cain are going to stick with him. Just as liberals sold out every one of their liberal values by sticking with Bill Clinton. They said, I mean, Paula Jones came forward and said, he was governor, I was a low-level state employee, he exposed himself in a hotel room right in front of me. Now, none of us were there. We don't know if it's true or not, absolutely. I believe it. I have no doubt that it happened, actually, but I don't have proof that it happened. When Kathleen Willey said that the president grabbed her ass in the White House, I believe that. When Juanita Broaddrick said, and she was a respected businesswoman, she wasn't 25 years old either, she was a respected grown-up businesswoman, said that Bill Clinton raped her in a hotel room in Little Rock when he was Attorney General of the state. I believe that. Okay? I don't know any of these things for absolute certainty any more than we know for absolute certainty what happened with Herman Cain and these women. But if it turns out at some point, if there's evidence that these things happen, we have a choice. We could be just like those pathetic liberals who stood by Clinton instead of by their values. We conservatives have values too. Are we going to stand by our values, or are we going to stand by Herman Cain if it turns out that there's more to it? And I think I understand why this happens. What we're really saying is, those liberal bastards have been screwing us for years, especially the ones in the media. And if one of our guys does something now, we're not going to roll over on them. We're just not going to do it. They stood by their guy, we're going to stand by our guy. This is what happened after O.J. Simpson was found not guilty, and there was that shot on television with all the black college kids cheering. You think they were cheering because the evidence was overwhelming that O.J. Simpson was innocent? No, they were cheering because they said, take that, Whitey. You've been screwing with us, now we're screwing with you. Well, we could do that. And then let's make no mistake. Let's not be sanctimonious. We will be no better than the people who we've been condemning on the other side. That's my concern about conservative orthodoxy. This is about the split in the Republican Party, and there is a split. And it's between the purists and the realists. The purists, Rush Limbaugh would be a leading spokesman on that side, along with some Tea Party people. They want the most conservative candidate in this group to get the nomination. The realists want the most viable conservative candidate to get the nomination, meaning the one who can actually beat Barack Obama. That's the Bill Buckley philosophy. For whatever it's worth, I'm on Team Buckley on that. Now, the conservatives say, and Rush Limbaugh is very smart when it comes to politics. He's not just good on the radio, he's very smart. He says, but the most conservative candidate can win. Well, I think he's wrong. He points to Ronald Reagan and says, Ronald Reagan was conservative, and he carried 49 states in one election. Okay, name 2 conservative presidents in the last 80 years. Name 2. You can't. There's only one, Ronald Reagan. And it wasn't just because he was conservative, it was because of his personality, because of his optimism. Yes, Eisenhower, he wasn't a conservative, Nixon wasn't, neither of the Bushes were conservative. They were more conservative than their liberal opponents, yes, but they weren't conservative. And if we had nominated a more conservative candidate than whichever ones we nominated, there's a good chance that person would have lost the general election. You think Pat Buchanan would win the election? You think Rush Limbaugh articulates conservative values probably better than any famous person in America. Rush Limbaugh couldn't be elected anything on a national ticket, on a coast-to-coast national ticket. Why not? If he's the most conservative, why couldn't he win? Because he's too polarizing. People love him or hate him. And I tend to think that's what happens when the purists want the most conservative candidate, because they want it to happen, they think it will happen, that the most conservative candidate will win the election. It'd be nice if the most conservative candidate would, but I want the most viable conservative to win the nomination, because I want Barack Obama to take a hike next election day. And if that means supporting somebody who isn't a real conservative, I have no problem doing that. And I'm not selling out my values, which is the emails I always get. If I say something good about Mitt Romney, you're a sellout, you have no principles. Bull. I have principles. I'm just not a purist where I think that compromise is tantamount to a crime against humanity. And I'm not giving an inch because our side, Rush says, why do we have to compromise? Our side won. Our side won what? We won the last election. Last time I checked, the president was still a Democrat and the Senate was still Democratic. This kind of thinking, let me end with this. This kind of thinking will lead to a Democratic victory. If Barack Obama wins re-election, it won't be because the economy suddenly got better. It won't be because unemployment is suddenly 6 or 7%. It won't be because suddenly, instead of 75% of the American people thinking we're on the wrong track, they think we're on the right track. If we lose this election, it will be for one reason, because we picked the wrong candidate. I hope we picked the right candidate. Thank you.